comfortable. You don't have to feel embarrassed.
So while you're getting set up, do you mind if I introduce you real quick?
Please, by all means.
So, as you guys know, as Mr. Kehoe just spoke to you about, we are just unbelievably privileged to, once again, for the third year in a row, have Mr. Galan with us to share his story. As I've mentioned to you guys before, I've had the privilege of now hearing this story a few times, and it is one of the most incredible stories. Every emotion you can possibly feel, everything, that you want in the story, you guys are about to hear. It is, again, an absolute honor to have him here. It's a privilege for you guys to get to hear this, right? It's not very often that we get to hear from people who experience the events that we're learning about in class, right? The things that you guys learned about, the pictures you saw, the videos you watched. He was there. He saw it. Okay, so he's going to tell his personal story. Like we said, we'll have you guys, listen, we'll have him tell his story, and then we'll open it up for some questions at the end. All right. So as Mr. Kehoe said, right, we're fully expecting, best 8th grade West Side behavior. You guys know what that means. So without further ado, Mr. Galan, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. How much do you guys know about the World War II and the Holocaust? Do you know any, any background information? You know a lot? Oh, but
We're
you know
about it, yeah.
I'm sorry?
We're informed about it.
Sure. Terrific. Well, I'm one of those lucky people who survived. I was a little kid. I was 10 years old when it all ended. Just trying to get my bearings in terms of where to start. I started when I was 6 years old. I lived in a country called Czechoslovakia in Eastern Europe. And Czechoslovakia was initially a democratic country, just like the United States, with the same freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom to vote, freedom to express yourself, freedom of religion, freedom of press. It was a democracy, just like we are. But in 1939, you know who Hitler was? Anybody didn't know who Hitler was? Okay, I'm happy to see that. He had designs on dominating all of Europe, and he was not only a Jew hater, but he hated all the Slavic people, Slavic people. That's a number of different groups of people who were part of the Slav nations years ago, centuries back. And Slovakia, where I lived, was also a Slavic nation. And the Czech people were also a Slavic nation. And the Czechs and the Slovaks had a country together, which was the democracy I just described. Well, and the Czech part of the country, also known as Bohemia, bordered on Germany. Germany became a Nazi country in 1933. That's when Hitler became the chancellor and the head of the German government. But he had ideas for a long time before then about Germany should dominate Europe, and he especially had these ideas that the Jewish people are the cause of all the problems that Germany was going through after the First World War. And he blamed everything on the Jews. But part of his scheme to start taking over parts of other countries, that's what I love about New York. by the way, I worked and also lived in Manhattan for a long time. I don't now, but I know New York inside out. So anyway, getting back to our story. There was a part of Czechoslovakia called Sudetenland, which bordered directly on Germany. And the Sudetenland was inhabited by ethnic Germans, people who were of German origin. So in 1938, Hitler made claims on the fact that the Sudetenland should become part of Germany again because of the fact that all the people living there are German. But the fact was that they lived in Czechoslovakia, and the fact that they were very happy living in Czechoslovakia. But Hitler insisted that the Sudetenland should become part of Germany. And it became a world affair, a world problem, his insistence, because he made all kinds of threats. And the British, you know who the British are, right? Britain is England. I'm making assumptions. I shouldn't make assumptions, but I need to ask you whether you know some of these facts so it doesn't go over your heads. You're 8th graders, right? Okay, terrific. So anyway, he was insisting that the Sudetenland should be part of Germany, which it wasn't. So Britain and France and some other countries were negotiating with him because he was making all kinds of threats of violent overtake of the Sudetenland. And finally they came to an agreement. They signed a treaty which the British Prime Minister described as the treaty that's going to guarantee peace in their time, peace in our time. And the British Prime Minister's name was Neville Chamberlain. So they made a deal with Hitler that he would leave the Sudetenland alone, and signed a treaty to that effect. And shortly thereafter, he invaded the Sudetenland and took it over. And that was really the early stages of what became World War II. And before long, he invaded all of Czechoslovakia, not militarily, but politically, took over all of Czechoslovakia, divided the two nations, the Czechs and the Slovaks, into two separate countries, and Bohemia, which was the other name for the Czech part of the country, fell completely under German influence. And in Slovakia, where I was living, where I was growing up, he formed a new government which was completely subservient to Nazi Germany. So, and once the Slovakia became part of, or completely under German influence, under Nazi influence, Slovakia formed its own government, as I said, which was friends with Nazi Germany, and they adopted a set of laws which already existed in Nazi Germany called the Nuremberg laws. And these Nuremberg laws pertained to the Jewish population of Nazi Germany, and then as of that period when the takeover took place, the Slovak government also adopted the Nuremberg laws. And these laws were completely focused on the long-term treatment of the Jewish people. Because the Jewish people were considered not only subservient but inferior to the German people, inferior to all the Christian people, and the ultimate goal of these laws was the complete control and annihilation of the Jews. And later on, after the outbreak of World War II, they set up another series of laws called the Wannsee Laws, which were put together at a conference called the Wannsee Conference. And that had to do with how they were going to eradicate the Jewish people. I was 6 years old in 1940. And one of the first things that I remember is that every Jewish person in Slovakia had to wear a yellow star. Because a star is the symbol of, the six-pointed star is the symbol of the Jewish people. And we as Jews had to be branded with that yellow star with the word Jew written inside the star. And as a 6-year-old, I had to go put on this yellow star. And I and all other Jewish people were not allowed to go out in public without wearing that star. Which means we were branded, we were differentiated from the rest of the population, and we became subject to a whole set of rules and laws. But the worst thing that could happen to a 6-year-old kid is to be marked. Hey, you're a Jew. You're different from the rest of us. You're different from the rest of us. You're not as good as we are. You're subhuman. You're not allowed to be out in the street after dark. Other kids in the streets who were not Jewish, they would see me and they would call me names. They would call me names. Dirty Jew, lousy Jew. Hey Jew, why don't you die? Sometimes they would beat me up in the street. In public. And people would just walk by and laugh. Look at that, beating up that Jewish kid. So that was, from my point of view as a 6-year-old, terrible. From the point of view of adults, it was terrible too. Because they too were openly being discriminated and called names. And they felt the effects much more than a 6-year-old kid. Because I had 2 older sisters. They were almost 9 years older than I. They were in school. They were in public school. They were kicked out of public school, as well as all the other Jewish students. They were expelled from public schools. If you were Jewish and you had a business, whether it was a small grocery store or a big business, whatever, your business was taken away from you. You had no privileges. Your rights were being taken away on a day-to-day basis. Almost to the point where in a small town like we lived in, we had a population of about 25,000 or 30,000, out of which 5,000 were Jewish. They had a public address system. In other words, loudspeakers all through the center of the city. And you'd be walking in the street and all of a sudden these speakers would come on, they would play some kind of a nationalistic song, and the next thing you hear was, "Attention all Jews, attention all Jews." This was in public. And the next thing you would hear from the public address system would be, "As of today, all Jews are restricted from being out after dark. You are subject to a curfew." Or after today, all Jews have to wear a yellow star. After today, all Jews, different kinds of things that were being announced publicly for everybody to hear. It was embarrassing It was dehumanizing. Because people who you used to be friends with, who were not necessarily Jewish, they suddenly looked at you like you were a different person, like you were a different human being. You were made to feel inferior. If somebody had a fur coat in the winter who was Jewish, they were not allowed to wear furs. I mean, things that were trivial and things that were important. We had to report to the authorities because in that country you had to have more than just for an ID. Here we have a driver's license, right? That's your ID. There, you had to have a whole document which stated that you were Jewish, but in addition to that, you had to go and report to the authorities where they stamped your identity document with a big red stamp saying Jew. There were dozens and dozens of new rules which were aimed to primarily dehumanize you, to feel you less than a human being, to feel inferior to the rest of the population. So things were really getting tough. Very, very difficult. There were restrictions on how much money you could have. You had to turn your money go into a bank and they would put stamps on the currency that you had. And if you had more than the allowed amount, they would just take it away from you. So this was the early days. 1939, Germany invaded Poland, so war broke out in September of 1939. By 1940, there were rumors of the Jewish people being resettled somewhere else, where they would have to leave their homes and be taken somewhere for resettlement, where they would perform hard labor. They didn't mean resettlement. Resettlement was a lie. Because by 1941, and I know these days don't mean much to you because you weren't born yet, and I was just a little kid, but I felt it personally, along with all my friends and my family and everyone else who was Jewish. We felt all these things, and we were scared, and we lived in fear. And by 1941, they began rounding up young boys of 18 and over to be shipped out to do hard labor. And the place where they were shipping people out was to the neighboring country called Poland, where the war was already on. And we watched young boys in that age group getting rounded up by the police and marched through town to the train station, where they were loaded into boxcars, into cattle cars. And we all walked along on the sidewalks as they were being marched to the train station, surrounded by armed guards. And these were not criminals, but they were surrounded by armed guards carrying weapons, pointing at them. And at the train station, they were loaded into these cattle cars, and their parents stood there and their siblings stood there, crying, calling out to them, and waving goodbye, not knowing where their sons were being taken, and never seeing them again, because they disappeared. They were never heard from again. And a short while later, they did the same thing with young girls who were 18 and older. they shipped them out. It was a very, very frightening time. And before long, they, and by they I'm talking about the government police, which was a black uniformed police. There was a special police unit set up throughout the country. It was more like a militia, who wore black uniforms, jack boots, carried skull and crossbones on their lapels, and their sole purpose was to deal with the Jewish population. So before long they started rounding up whole families. Whole families were rounded up, taken to the local high school, kept there for a few days until they gathered up enough people for a particular, what they called a transport, and marched to the trains, loaded into cattle cars, and shipped out. We too were subject to it, my family. But my father's occupation was such, where he, even though he no longer owned his own business, it was taken away from him, but his occupation was such that it was considered important to the welfare of the country. He was a grain merchant. He would buy grains from the farms and sell it to the mills, which turned it into flour and cereals and other foodstuffs. So it was very important what he was doing, because people have to be fed. And he had an expertise in this. So he was given a special permit by the government, which accepted him from being taken away, and then applied to our family also. He was allowed to continue doing what he was doing, even though the business was not his anymore. There was another man, a Christian man, who owned the business, who used to be my father's friend for many years. But he came to own my father's business. He knew nothing about grains. He knew nothing about who to sell it to or who to buy it from. But he was reaping all the profits from the business and paying my father his salary. So people were being rounded up, and we were kind of sort of semi-assured of our safety, that we wouldn't be taken away. And this lasted for a few months. In the beginning of 1942, in the middle of one night, we were sound asleep in our apartment, and suddenly there was pounding on our front door, and screaming, yelling, "Open up, open up, open up. This is the police, open up." So we're all awakened from our sleep. My father opened the door, and there were 5 or 6 of these black uniformed guys standing there. They barged into our home, yelling and screaming, "Everybody, wake up, get dressed. You're being taken away for resettlement." I was not quite 7 years old when this happened. I was so frightened in the middle of the night. Why are they taking us away? What are they going to do with us? What's going to happen to us? And my parents were reassuring me, and my sisters were reassuring me that we're going to be all right. Not to cry, not to fear, not to worry. But I was so scared. And we all got dressed. They allowed us each to take one bag with our clothing and belongings. And in the middle of the night, they led us to the local high school. Surrounded by these guys, they were like hoodlums, these people. And we brought to the high school where there were already a few hundred people assembled. A lot of women and children, old people, young people, sitting on the ground. And the guards are going around among people and picking people out at random from the crowd. Men, especially religious people who had beards and wore the traditional black clothes. Picking them out of the crowd and making them stand up and sing and dance. Just to humiliate them. Nobody wanted to sing, nobody wanted to dance, but they made them stand up and sing some song and sing along with it. And if they didn't do it loud enough or fast enough, these guards would start beating them with nightsticks and kicking them. And in some cases, cutting their beards off with their bayonets. Or plucking the hair out of their faces with their bare hands, just pulling the hair out of their faces. And this went on for 2 days. They beat my father up. He was bloody completely. There was blood streaming down from his face, from his head, over his clothes. For no reason whatsoever. My father never harmed a fly. He was a decent, honorable, hard-working man. They beat him up. And I cried. I couldn't understand it. It's very hard to understand hatred. Very hard to comprehend why people hate other people when they're innocent. So we were kept there in this confinement for 2 days. On the third morning, they released us. We didn't know why, but they released us. They let us go. As we left the school, out in the street, stood my uncle, who approached us, hugged us, says, "I'm glad that you were able to get out." And he took us home. When we got to our home, the front door was unlocked. The lock was broken. We walked in. The place was ransacked. Our neighbors figured out, the Jews are gone, we can take all their possessions. So they stole anything they could. And when they saw us come back, they started bringing stuff back, saying, "Oh, we took it for safekeeping." But we found out why we were released, why we were taken away, and why we were released. My uncle told us. He knew that my father had this special document from the government protecting us. And when he found out that we were taken away, he went to inquire why we were taken away. And he found out that the man who now owned his business turned us into the authorities, told them, "I no longer need the Jew. I've learned enough about this business. Take him away. I don't need him anymore." So they took us away. When my uncle found this out, he did a very brave thing. unbeknown to us, he had a pistol, he had a gun that he kept. He walked into this man's office, my father's so-called boss's office, pulled a gun on him, and threatened his life unless he goes back to the authorities and gets my father released. Make up a story and get him released, otherwise I'm going to kill you. And this man, with my uncle, walked down the main street of the town to the government building, and my uncle stood outside with his hand in his pocket holding the gun, telling this guy, if you come out without a document releasing them, I'm going to shoot you and I'm going to shoot myself. This is my family, and if anything happens to them, because you turned them in, you did a mean act out of greed and hatred, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to shoot you, I'm going to shoot myself. I don't care, my life is not worth living. And he scared this guy well enough where he got us released. So we were back in our home as a result of my uncle's bravery, and readjusted to things missing that was not important. The fact is, we were out of the roundup. But we were worried. My father was worried, my mother was worried, my sisters were worried about the future. What are we going to do next? What is to stop them from taking us away again? And my father went to look for ways to protect ourselves. Now, my father was really a good man and very well liked, not only within the community, but even in the surrounding area and the villages where the farms were. He had a number of friends, including a Catholic priest, including a Lutheran minister, other clergymen, Christian clergymen. He was respected and he liked them, they were friends. So my father approached the Lutheran minister in one village and asked him if he would issue us baptismal certificates saying that we had converted to Christianity. And his minister said, I can't just go and issue certificates without you going through baptism, because my higher authorities would not allow that. I have to talk to them first and see if they give me permission to do it. I personally would be happy to do it. But he didn't get permission from the higher authorities. And all they said was, if they're willing to go through baptism, by all means, you can then issue them baptismal certificates. So, all of us, except one of my sisters, her name was Susan, agreed that we're going to go through baptism. And Susan said, no, I will not, because I'm a Jew and I want to be a Jew. I want to die as a Jew if I have to die. I'm not going to go be baptized. I believe in my faith. So my father went back to see the minister and told him about the problem with my sister. And you know what the minister said? He said, if you and the rest of the family become baptized, and Susan doesn't, I will issue her a baptismal certificate regardless of what my superiors tell me. I admire her bravery, I admire her courage. as long as the rest of you do it. So we agreed. We went through a process of study about the catechism, and on July 26, 1942, we became baptized, and we became Lutherans. This is the certificate stating my name, date of birth, that I was baptized into the Lutheran Church. And we began to live our lives as Christians. Attended church, observed all the holidays, went to services every Sunday morning, getting used to it but not feeling totally comfortable, because we knew, in our hearts, we knew who we were. We knew we were Jews. Our families were Jews. But it was saving our lives. And the minister understood this. And he spent a lot of time talking to us, encouraging us. He was really a very decent, good human being. A few months later, the government decided that there were too many Jews trying to save their lives by converting to Christianity. So they decided to pass a new law stating that any Jewish people who converted to Christianity after 1939 were still considered Jews and are subject to all the Nuremberg laws and the results of the Wannsee Conference. And they can be sent away. So our lives changed again, not significantly, because we knew in our hearts who we were. So we returned to practicing our Jewish faith. And attending services in a synagogue and wondering what's going to happen to us next. Are you all with me so far? In the spring of 1943, the police showed up at our home. Informing us that we are being taken to a labor camp. They didn't use the words resettlement. They were taking us to a labor camp in Slovakia, not in another country, not in Poland. We knew about the existence of this camp because it was in our country, and we knew some people who were taken there. And they would write letters, and they were talking about the decent treatment. There was no torture, no mention of killing. And that's the camp that we were being taken to. As it happened, my sister Susan, the same one who refused to be baptized, she wasn't home that morning. She was at a friend's house when they came to arrest us. And the police wanted to know, where is your daughter Susan? My father said, I don't know. She hasn't been home since last night. We don't know where she is. I said, well, we'll find her. And they took us to the local jail. We were allowed to take certain personal belongings. They took us to the local jail. They locked us up there while they were searching for my sister all over town. They kept us there for about 4 or 5 days in the jail. They never found my sister. So finally they took us, my other sister and my parents and me, by train. They took us to a labor camp in the western part of the country. This was a large camp. There were about 1,500 people there, living behind barbed wires, living in barracks of about 100 people. Every adult had to perform different types of labor. Women were doing lighter work, men were doing harder work, digging ditches, helping build barracks, things like that. And kids, like myself, we were actually going to a makeshift school that was set up. It was like a one-room school where one teacher who was also in prison there, she was teaching all of us. And we lived in this camp for a whole year. It gets better, kids. It gets better, believe me. We lived in this camp for a whole year, not knowing what was going to happen to us, being afraid that we may still be loaded into trains and shipped out to Poland. And there were rumors circulating by that time that people in Poland are being murdered. But no one could really prove it. We could say, no, it couldn't happen. How could they be murdering everybody? It was hard to believe the stories that were circulating. And we continued in this camp for a whole year, until 1944. There were several things that happened in 1944. You know, the war was raging since 1939. The Russians, the British, and the Americans were fighting against the Nazis all over Europe. For a while, the Germans were were really beating the Russians very, very badly. They were in Russia, they were killing hundreds of thousands of Russian people in the war. And finally, when America entered the war, it started sending Russia weapons to help them fight against the Germans. And it took a while before the Russians got the upper hand, but in 1944, they finally began beating the Germans back and pushing them out of Russia. In the spring of 1944, in June, the Americans and the British did an invasion of Europe. They landed in Normandy. Have you guys ever heard of the landing in Normandy? You have? Okay. June 6th, there was a landing in Normandy where hundreds of thousands of American and British and French troops came from the sea through the English Channel and landed on the coast of France in Normandy and brought the war directly to the Germans. At first, lots of Americans were killed in the battles, and lots of British soldiers were killed in the battles, and other people, lots of civilians were getting killed as a result of the warfare. But after a couple of months, the Americans and the British began getting the upper hand. And we heard about this because there were a few people in our camp who had radios, shortwave radios hidden away, and they were getting the news from America and from England. There was something called the Voice of America, which was broadcasting all through the world on what the war, the status of the war. And we heard this, and it gave us encouragement that the war might end soon. And at the same time, in Slovakia, the Americans were dropping paratroopers, mostly Slovak and Czech paratroopers, and a lot of Americans and Brits, into Slovakia with weapons to start an uprising against the pro-Nazi government. And before long, these resistance fighters, who were known as partisans, they were starting to defeat the Slovak army. And our camp was liberated one day. You know what liberated means? Do you? It means we were freed. They surrounded the camp, they disarmed all the guards, they locked them up in the barracks, and we were free to leave the camp. So we left the camp. We moved to a nearby city that was also liberated. Remember that word liberated? You know the Statue of Liberty? What does that stand for? Somebody tell me. What does the Statue of Liberty stand for? Freedom. Liberated means being made free. Good. So we were freed to leave the camp. But it didn't last long because Germany sent troops into the country, into Slovakia. And they began to get the upper hand with the resistance. And before long, the resistance fighters were losing, and they were escaping into the mountains. And the Germans had invaded the country, and they were, as I said, getting the upper hand, and we had to go running. We had to find some other place to go to where we could be safer. And we also headed for the mountains. On foot for several days in bad weather. We were trekking on the roads, sleeping in barns, until we reached the mountain range. There's a huge mountain range in the country called the Tatra Mountains. And we started heading towards the forest. This one particular day, we were already near the forest. A terrible storm developed, a rainstorm. Lightning and thundering and a heavy rain all day long. And we were trudging on the road, soaking wet. We didn't have rain clothes or anything like that. Our shoes wet, our feet wet, our soles wet, heading towards the forest. And it was lightning and thundering, and it was getting dark. And finally we reached the forest. There were lots of other people with us. And all of a sudden a rumor started that the German troops are following us, pursuing us. And we go into the forest, and we start climbing the elevation, and we see searchlights scanning the edges of the forest. Those are Germans looking for people who were escaping. And we heard gunshots in the background. So we pick up our pace and go deeper and deeper into the forest. And by now it's pitch black. We can't see anything except the occasional bolt of lightning would illuminate the whole place. And people are in a panic. They're scattering in different directions, not knowing where to go. And we just keep going up. And all of a sudden we notice that my sister, who was with us, is not with us. She disappeared in the darkness. And we stop and we start calling her name while all the other people are going past us. And we are standing there in this downpour calling my sister's name, Eva, Eva, Eva. There's no answer. We couldn't hear because of the thunder and the heavy rain, and there was no sign of her. We stood there for a long time just calling, calling, calling. No response. So finally my father says, well, we can't stay here. The Germans might catch up with us. I don't know if they're coming or not. We have to keep going. So we resumed our journey into the forest. For hours, being wet and cold and just feeling horrible and upset, frightened because my sister was gone. So now both my sisters have disappeared from us. And after a while we just couldn't go any further. We were totally exhausted. We were soaking wet, cold. We just decided to stay wherever we are. And we huddled together, put our arms around each other, sitting on the wet ground, trying to keep each other warm with the rain coming down constantly. Hours later, it was already beginning of dawn. Daylight was appearing, and the rain had finally stopped. And there was not a human being anywhere near us. Just the stillness of the forest, the chirping of the birds, that was it. So we had to resume our journey. Couldn't stay there. So my father says, listen, if we keep going up, there's a stream running down the mountain right near us. If we follow this stream, it might lead us to a village. Well, maybe we can find shelter. So we continued our trek, and hours later, we came upon a tiny little village of about 10 houses. We were high up in the mountains by that time. Here I have a picture of that village that I took from Google Earth. It's hard for you to see. You can circulate this if you would like, but it's the only copy I have. And you can see the outlines of the houses. There are few houses here, and a single road leading through the village. Can you see it? Yeah. And we went from one house to the next, knocking on doors, pleading for shelter. And at first people said, no, go away, you're strangers here, we don't know who you are. You might even be Jews, so go away, we don't like Jews. So we went from one house to the next, and finally, one of the houses we came to, and we also had forged identity papers stating that we were Lutherans, and our names were changed as proof that we are not Jews. And finally, one of the farmers believed our story and allowed us to come in and stay with them in their household. So we settled in with this family. This was already the end of September. We're very high up in the mountains. Gets cold up there. Before long, by middle of October, it began to snow. The roads became impassable. And the villagers were saying the Germans would never come to this village anymore because of the snow. We're so high up, the roads are impassable. They could never make it here. And by late October, one morning we woke up, looked out the window, and the street, the one street that ran through the town, there were several hundred German troops with all kinds of weapons, all kinds of vehicles, tracked vehicles. It was very scary to see that. So now the Germans were right there, outside the house. And before long, two soldiers came walking into the house with their weapons. They walked into the house, asking everybody for their identity papers. They checked everybody out, and they said, "You're not hiding any Jews here, are you?" The farmer said, "Jews? We never saw Jews in our lives. They've never been here. We don't even know what Jews look like." Assumption being that they look different from us. So the soldier said, "Okay, well, you better keep it that way, because if you're hiding anybody, you'll be punished." And they left. Our hearts were beating very fast that day because we were so frightened. This is the first time that we encountered German troops. That evening, we're getting ready to go to bed. There was no electricity in this village. There was nothing to do. You couldn't even read. If you had a book, you couldn't even read it because there was no light. The only source of light was kerosene lamps that you light with a match. So we're getting ready to go to bed. All of a sudden there's pounding on the front door. Pounding on the front door. Farmer goes and opens the door, and there are 3 German soldiers there. One of them is an officer, and the other 2 are foot soldiers. They walk in, and the officer says in German, "We need a place to sleep." Schlafen, which is the German for sleep. And he looks around, and the family and we all slept in one room. There were beds and cots spread out all over this one common room. And the officer looks around, and he sees how many, there were 10 of us. And the number of beds sort of represented just about that many people, maybe fewer. So he's looking around, and he finally points to one of the beds, and he says, "I'm going to sleep in that bed." And he tells the 2 soldiers to spread their blankets on the floor and sleep on the blankets on the floor. And the officer proceeds to the bed that happened to be the one that my father and I slept in. My mother had a narrow cot right next to us. And he proceeds to that bed, takes off all his gear, puts the weapon down on the floor, his backpack, pulls off his boots, takes his clothes off, and gets into the bed, ready to go to sleep. So now, my mother, my father, and I, the 3 of us, are trying to squeeze into this narrow bed that my mother had. And the German officer sees this, and is trying to be a nice guy. He says, "Oh, you don't have to do that. Let the little boy sleep in my bed." Not funny. It had nothing to do with sex, I assure you. I did not want to go to sleep in the same bed with the German soldier because I was frightened of them. And my parents didn't want me to sleep in the same bed either, out of fear that he might discover that I'm Jewish. Luckily, the moment I got into bed, he fell asleep. I turned my back to him. I reached out to my mother, who was in the cot next to me with my father. She took my hand, held my hand all through the night, never letting go. I never slept, she never slept, my father never slept. We held our breaths, waiting for the night to pass, while the German officer was snoring away, and the night passed without any incident. In the morning, the Germans got up, everybody woke up, everybody got up, they got dressed and they left. It was one of the scariest nights of my life. Several days went by. These three did not return. But every day, soldiers came into the house to check identity papers. They were in the village for about a week. Every day we watched them go up into the mountains. They were searching for resistance fighters. And we never saw them bring down any prisoners, which made us very happy. About a week after all this, one night, in the middle of the night, there's pounding on the front door. Sorry. Pounding on the front door. We wake up. The farmer goes open the door. And there's another German officer, an SS officer, shining a flashlight into the farmer's face. He walks right by him, comes walking into the house with the flashlight, and he sees the room with everybody in bed. And he goes from one person to the next, shining the light in their faces. And finally comes to my mother. My mother is blinded, and he says to her, "Can I sit down?" And he goes and sits down on the edge of her cot. And he says to her in German, he says, "I know that you can understand me. I know you speak German because you're a Jew. You are here with your husband and your son. The villagers have turned you in. They have turned you in. We are leaving here at dawn. The whole German contingent is leaving at dawn. I came to warn you not to trust the villagers and to tell you that you should leave this village as soon as you can, because there will be other German troops coming here and the villagers will turn you in again, and next time I won't be here. You will not be lucky enough to be warned. So I'm telling you, leave this village as soon as you can." Don't trust anybody here. Not even the people whose house you're staying in. And with that he got up and he wished my mother good luck, and he noticed her wristwatch and said, "What a pretty watch. Could I have it, please?" So she took it off, handed it to him, and he said, "Thank you." And my mother said thank you to him for warning us, and he left. I never found out who he was. We never found out who he was. We never found out why he did this act of kindness to come and save our lives. And at dawn, the Germans left the village. And we were still there, alive. And 2 days later, we got a farmer with a horse and a sled to take us to a different village, where after several hours of trekking through the snow-covered roads, we got to this village, and this farmer knew other people there and took us to one particular house where he knew the residents, and told them that we are looking for a place to stay. So they were asking us all kinds of questions, who we are, why, and so forth and so on. And we satisfied their questions. There were no men in the household. They were all working, we found out, in a coal mine in another part of the country. Sorry about this. So the woman of the house agreed to take us in. And we settled in with them. And we made ourselves useful. My mother started sewing their clothes, repairing their clothes. My father and I would haul in firewood, do some chores around the house, and they accepted us. Several times, Germans came into the village. We could see them coming because the village was in a valley, and the soldiers would surround the village, and then they would come in and go from house to house. So the woman of the house hid us. She had a cellar, a potato cellar in the barn. She hid us in this cellar, covered the door with bales of hay and bags of grain so the door wouldn't be visible. And we would stay there, sometimes for a day, sometimes for 2 days. She provided us with some bare food. We would hear the footsteps of the soldiers when they came into the barn. Loud boots. They were searching the barn to see if there was anybody hidden there. They would talk to each other, we could hear them. They were looking for Jews, they were looking for partisans, for resistance fighters. They were telling jokes to each other. One time the soldiers were not even German, they were Ukrainian. There was a Ukrainian division in the German army. There were Ukrainian collaborators who worked with the Germans. They never found us. We hid in that cellar several times, they never found us. Christmas was approaching, and the menfolk of the house came home for the holidays. There was one young guy among the men. He was the son-in-law of this family's daughter. I mean the husband of this family's daughter, the son-in-law of the family. And he immediately started picking on us, wondering, why are we there? Saying, you must be Jews because you don't belong here. We don't want you here, you should leave. He would constantly pressure us that we should leave the house. And the woman of the house would tell him to leave us alone. But he was finding ways of harassing us, of making us uncomfortable, of making us want to leave, which we didn't. We had no place to go. And we kept denying that we were Jews. We were denying that. And this went on for day to day. Christmas had passed, and he was still persisting with this. And a few days after Christmas, the 30th of December. I remember the date because it was my father's birthday. The Germans came into the village. There was no time to hide. They came early in the morning. 2 German soldiers came into the house carrying their machine guns, telling all men, all adult men, to get their coats on and go out to the street to take their documents with them to be identified by an officer. So all the men gathered up their things, including my father. He had no choice, and left the house, went out to the street. Then these 2 soldiers proceeded to check everyone else's identity papers. And when they got to my mother and me, they took a good look at us and they said, "You're coming with us. Get your coats on, you're coming with us." I turned to my mother and I whispered to her, "This is it, we are dead, we're finished." And she said to me, "Paul, don't give up hope. Don't give up hope. We're not dead yet." We bundled up for the cold, and the 2 soldiers stood behind us with their automatic weapons pointing at us. They told us to go out. So we walked out of the house into the farmyard. We're heading to the gate, to the fence that separated it from the street. And they're walking right behind us, pointing their guns at us. And all of a sudden, one of the soldiers comes around to face us, and he says, "Go back, go back." The gun was pointing down. He says, "Schnell, schnell," which means quickly, go back. So we were bewildered for the moment, and he says, "Schnell, schnell, go back." My mother grabbed me by the hand, and we ran into the house. We ran into the house, shut the door. As soon as the door was closed, the 2 soldiers left. They went out to the street. We're still shaken up from this experience. And then the men returned, and my father was not with them. And I asked, "Where's my father?" So this young guy, the one who was such a mean, miserable guy, says, "Your father." German officer took one look at him and he said, "You, the Jew." They took him away. So don't worry, he's probably dead by now. They probably shot him. They probably shot him, he's dead by now. But you can't stay here any longer because now I know that you are Jews. I don't want you here. He says, "Get out." And I began to cry and plead and turned to the woman of the house. And I was begging, "How can you throw us out? We have no place to go. We have nowhere to go. If we go out, the Germans will take us. Just like they took my father. Please, let us stay. We're not Jews. We're not harming anybody. You know that," I said to the woman. And my mother was crying. And she finally said to her son-in-law, "Leave them alone. They're nice people." It's a mother with a little kid. I was 9 years old. "Leave them alone." So he relented. And about 2 days later, the men left. They went back to the coal mines to work. And things quieted down. And the woman was even apologetic for her son-in-law. She was really a decent person. Germans came to the village a few more times. We managed to hide in the cellar each time. And then one day, it was already February, a resistance fighter, a woman resistance fighter, came walking into the house. She was a very tall, impressive woman wearing a sheepskin coat, high boots, and carrying a machine gun. She walks into the house, says hello to everybody, introduces herself, and she says, obviously you can tell that I'm a friend, not an enemy. And the woman of the house asks her to sit down. And we all sit down. We're so happy to see somebody with a weapon who's friendly. And she starts talking to us. And then at one point she says to my mother, is your name Serena? My mother says, yes, how do you know? She says, you have a daughter named Eva, don't you? Yes. And she sends her regards. She's up in the mountains with us. We found her wandering through the mountains back in the fall. And we took her in with us, and she's been with us ever since. She's safe. She's protected. And she asks me when I go to the various villages to see if I can find her mother, her parents, her family, her father, her mother, and her young brother. And I've been looking for you for months. Whenever I go to different places, I'm always looking. I am so happy that I found you. Your daughter is going to be overjoyed, as were we, by the way. We knew that my sister was alive. All these months we had no idea where she was, whether she was alive or not, whether she was captured by the Germans. So now we knew that she was okay. And this woman, this partisan, assured us that she's going to be looking out for us, that she goes to the villages all the time, and she'll warn us if the Germans are coming. And she'll communicate between us and our sister, my sister. So that was a tremendous relief to us. Still missing my other sister and my father. So this went on peacefully for a while. And then, beginning of March, she came back and she says, you have to leave this village. The good news is that the other side of the mountains is already liberated by the Russians. The country is free on that side of the mountain. Here, the Germans are panicking because they know that they will not last long. But what they're doing is they're going from village to village searching for Jews and searching for resistance fighters. And if they catch anybody, they shoot them, they kill them on the spot. So you have to leave this village. You're going to have to cross over the mountains. You're going to have to cross over the mountains. And once you accomplish that, you'll be free. I will come and tell you when you should be ready to go. Take nothing with you except the warmest clothes you can wear and enough food for one day. There'll be a group of other people coming through the village. You will join them and you'll do this together. You'll do this trek together. I'll tell you when to be ready to go. And a few days later she came, she said, tomorrow is the day. The weather will be good. We have the weather forecasts. The weather will be good. You'll meet these people coming through the village, join up with them. Remember, take nothing, no belongings of any kind, just food, because it's going to be a tough journey for you. And it's going to take you one day to go and get over to the other side of the mountains. And the following morning at dawn, we got up. We got dressed up as warm as we could. We had some food with us. We said goodbye to the family. The woman of the house even hugged us, wished us all the best. And we walked out onto the street, and there was a group of people coming through. We joined up with them, and we headed to the outskirts of the village where the mountains range began. And we started climbing. It was a tough climb because the snow on the mountains was very deep. But we persisted, we kept going. Through the deep snow, the sun was shining, it was warming us, it felt good. We kept going higher and higher and higher all day long. We wouldn't even stop to eat. Just we ate as we went, when we had to. And towards the afternoon, we were really getting very high. And by dusk, the weather changed. The weather changed, the wind started to blow. It started to snow, and a terrible blizzard developed. It was terrible. The wind was blowing hard. It was pushing us. The cold, the temperature dropped. And we just kept on going, moving higher and higher on the mountain. It became pitch black dark already. And the blizzard was relentless. It was horrible. A while later, the snow began to ice up. It became very slippery. We didn't know how high we were at that point. We didn't know where we were. We just kept going up, up and up. And at one point, I slipped on the icy snow. I let go of my mother's hand, and as I let go of her hand, I started to slide down. I fell down and I started to slide down. And I was sliding, and I tried to stop myself by digging my fingers into the snow, but the snow would let go, and I just kept sliding. And I was calling to my mother, "Mother, mother, mother, help me, help me. I'm sliding down, I don't know where I'm going." And she was calling back to me, to keep calling her so she knows from the sound of my voice where I am. I couldn't see a thing. It was so dark, and the wind was howling, and the snow was blowing. And I was sliding for a long period of time. And finally I stopped. And through the howling wind, I kept calling to my mother. She says, "I finally stopped. Help me, please help me." And she said, "Paul, keep talking to me, keep calling my name so I can tell from the sound of your voice where you are, and I will come and find you." And she laid down on the iced up snow and started sliding down in the darkness. And I didn't know where she was. I didn't know where I was. And suddenly I heard her land right near me. And from the sound of my voice, she found me. I landed on some kind of a plateau, some kind of a level ground. And the snow was not letting up. And I was so cold by then. I was so cold, I just wanted to go to sleep. I couldn't stay awake anymore. And my mother put her arms around me and kept shaking me to stay awake. She kept shaking me and talking to me and saying, "Paul, don't fall asleep. If you fall asleep, you will die. You will freeze to death. You will die. Don't fall asleep." She was shaking my shoulders. Stay awake, don't fall asleep." And she kept me awake all through the night. I've never been so cold in my life. My insides felt cold. My teeth were chattering. I couldn't warm up. She still had some sugar. She brought some sugar with her because she figured sugar gives you energy. She still had some sugar left, and she kept feeding me that sugar for energy. And by dawn, the storm had let up. the wind died down. The sun started to come up. And we saw this beautiful snow-covered, vast area. The sun was reflected from it. No sign of the people we were with earlier. We didn't know what happened to them. It was good to be with a group of people because we encouraged each other. You know, you felt better that there were other people. This time there was no one around. Just snowy mountains and a forest way in the distance down below. So we headed down. We surmised that we probably crossed over the top, that we were now in safe territory, but we weren't sure. So we started going down through the deep snow, and at one point we came upon a snowdrift, and out of the snowdrift there was a human arm sticking out. So we go there to see, and it's one of the men from the group we were with. He was frozen to death. It was a sheet of ice and snow. My mother covered my eyes and said, "I don't want you to see this. Go. Come on, let's go away. Let's get away from here." And we continued down the mountain for hours. And finally the forest was not too far from us. We could see it down below. And we noticed smoke rising from among the trees in the forest. So there was sign of humanity there. So we veered in that direction. Finally we reached level ground and we walk into the forest. And after a while we come upon a group of 3 log cabins. And outside the cabins there's a group of saddled horses tied up to a post. And there is the cabin with the smoke coming out of the chimney. So this time we're saying, all right, well, we don't know who's there. Could it be friend, could it be enemy? We don't know, but we don't care anymore. We have to get some warmth. We have to get some food. So I go and I knock on the door. And the door opens. And the person I see is a big, tall Russian, dressed in the uniform of the Russian army. And he says, "Who are you and what do you want?" And I said, "We just crossed over the mountains, we escaped the Germans. We are cold, we are hungry, could you please take us in?" And he said, "Sure," and he opened the door completely and let us in. And the first thing I saw was a pot-bellied stove with a fire in it and the heat coming out. And then there was a group of other Russians sitting around a big table with food on the table. And we said, "We're so hungry, can we please eat?" They were very welcoming. They said, "Sit down, take your coats off, warm up, eat all you want." They said, "You are in liberated territory. You no longer have to fear the Germans." And they gave us blankets, and we laid down on the floor next to the stove, covered ourselves, and we went to sleep. And we slept well into the following day. And then we ate more, and we talked with the Russians. They wanted to know where we are from. We told them the name of our hometown, which was in the east. And they said, "Your town has been liberated in November." This was March. That's how long it took for them to get across the country. They were very nice to us. And finally we said, we're trying to get home. How do we go? They gave us directions. They said, "There's no regular transportation. you'll have to hitchhike, and it's going to take you a long time. It will take you days before you get home because you're so far away. So the next morning we started out. We had enough food for a few days. We finally walked out of the forest to a country road which was full of soldiers and farm wagons and military trucks, and we hitched our way on some of the farm wagons, and later on a truck picked us up, and we came to a railway station in the evening. There were no trains running. It was post-war, everything was chaotic, and we encountered a new group of soldiers wearing different uniforms. They turned out to be Romanian soldiers. They fought with the Russians, and they were very friendly, very nice to us. They gave us food, they gave us blankets, and we slept on the floor in the railway station. It took us several days to get home, mostly on freight trains. And finally we arrived at our hometown one dawn. I could read the sign, the station sign had the name of our town. The train stopped, we got off the train. It was familiar territory, we've been there before, many times. And we start walking into town, which was about a mile to 2 miles further away. We see a few farm wagons pass us early in the morning. Farmers going to market or whatever. Horse-drawn wagons. And I turned to my mother and I said, all right, we are now here. Where do we go? We don't have a home. It's been a long time since we've been away from here. Almost 2 years. Where are we going to go? She said, I don't know, Paul. Let's just hope that we come across somebody who's friendly. And we finally walk into the center of town. And the first familiar thing that we saw was what was our synagogue. It was a large building in the center of town. All the windows on it were broken. The outer walls were scorched from fire. It was a sad sight to see. The streets were still empty. It was so early in the morning. And we continue walking around, and all of a sudden we hear our names, our first names being called. And we turn around and there's a man, a friend of our family, a good friend of our family, looking out the window, and he recognized my mother and me. And he comes running out of the house, embracing us, hugging us. Oh my God, it's so good to see you. It's so good to see that you're alive. Where's the rest of the family? We didn't know. He says, you come in with us, you stay with us. You'll be at home here. And so we found a place. We found friends. We had to shed all our clothes and throw them out because they were lice infested, they were dirty. We've been wearing the same clothes now for over a week. We were exhausted. We were hungry again. They fed us. We took baths, and they gave us a bed to sleep in. We felt like human beings again. When we woke up the next day, we started exchanging stories of what they went through, what we went through. We were so worried about my father and my sisters. We were hoping that Eva would show up one day. And about a week or so later, she showed up. She showed up in town. She had crossed over the mountains in good weather and made it home. So 3 of us were now alive. In May, May the 8th, the war ended. It was announced by the the town's single fire engine, going up and down the main street, people blowing bugles, carrying flags. The war is over, it's peace, peace. It was wonderful to know that the war was over, but we didn't know what happened to the rest of the family. Shortly after the war ended, people started returning from concentration camps. You know what the concentration camps were? Yes. Auschwitz and other places like that. Yes. People started coming back, 1 at a time, 2 at a time. And we found out that there were many, many other concentration camps. We started hearing stories about Auschwitz, the crematoria, the gas chambers. People were returning one by one. They looked like human skeletons. They were so thin, so emaciated. The women, in addition to being emaciated, their heads were shaved. And one man came one day and he said, he came looking for us because he heard we were there in town, and he told us that my father was alive. They were together in a camp called Buchenwald in Germany. They were liberated by the Americans, and after liberation he saw my father. So I said, your father should be home any day now. And a few nights later, my father arrived in town. And he found us. So we were overjoyed. Overjoyed. Several weeks later, my sister Susan, who we haven't seen in 2 years, she and one of my aunts came back. So my immediate family were all alive, plus one aunt. Out of 3 aunts, 1 survived. All the rest of the family perished. None of them survived. They were all taken to different camps, and they were either killed or died of starvation or disease. These people in the camps were kept on a minimal diet of about 190 calories a day. They would be given 1 piece of stale bread and a soup, which, if they were lucky, they would find a vegetable floating in that soup. There was no nutrition content in any of the food they were given. If they died of natural death, of disease or starvation, that was fine with the Germans, because that's exactly what their plan was. Use these people as slave laborers, and when they die, it saves us the trouble of killing them. 6 million people were killed that way. Plus other people, civilians. There were tens of millions, and soldiers. The survivors were very few. Jewish people lost the largest number. There were a lot of non-Jewish people who were killed, because the Germans also didn't like the Slavs. They didn't like the Polish people. They didn't like the Russians. They had no hesitation about killing them if they weren't either in war or just lining them up and killing them. What we also returned to in our hometown was huge level of anti-Semitism. You know what anti-Semitism is? Have you ever heard that term? Anti-Semitism is hatred of Jews. People didn't like us. People didn't want us to be returning alive. They thought we were bad people. We were peace-loving people. Pray to God. We all had the same God. Jesus was the Son of God. They accused us of having killed Jesus. We did not kill Jesus. That's a myth. We did not crucify anybody. We were peace-loving people. We still are. We decided we don't want to stay there because we were not liked. So we made plans to leave Czechoslovakia. We had to wait a long time to get permits to come to America. Meanwhile, the communists took over Czechoslovakia, so we now had a whole new problem to deal with, because it became a dictatorship. Czechoslovakia became a communist dictatorship, and Russia dominated us. During the war it was the Germans, now it was the Russians. But we managed to escape. Finally came to this country in 1951. I didn't speak a word of English. I started going to school in the Bronx, went to Morris High School. I learned to speak English. I became a very good student. My parents found jobs. My sisters found jobs. They had families, they were married, they had children. We made good lives in America. I went to City College right uptown, 139th Street. I became a film major. Film and history were my two major subjects. I graduated. I married my high school sweetheart. We have two children. They have grandchildren. I became a filmmaker. I traveled the world making films, documentary films. Met a lot of people. Came to one conclusion, that there was no better country anywhere than this country. Our democracy was unique. We have to protect it. We have to be good citizens. We have to vote. We have rights, inalienable rights in this country, given by the Constitution. We must never give up our rights, our freedom. We must be considerate of one another. We must learn not to discriminate against other people, whether they are black, whether they are yellow, whether they are Jews, Christians, Muslims, whoever. We have to be accepting of each other. It's a process that takes a long time, but we have to practice it. We have to be good to each other, considerate of each other, and make sure that the future is good to us. Make sure that we create a better future for all of us. And that's my story. I retired in 2006 and decided that I'm going to make it my mission. Give me your hand.
Maybe like a
have any questions?
We have like 2 minutes left. If there's a couple people who have a few questions, we can probably get through that. If you want to come up and kind of say hi and then thank Mr. Galan for his time and his story, that's also good and a good use of our last few moments here. So I will leave that to you guys.
Quiet, please. There's a question on the floor.
Hey guys, a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Questions. Eric's got one and then Maroon's got one back.
When you were in the cellar, what did you do for entertainment?
Entertainment?
Yeah.
What's that?
Like, what did you do to like...
In the cellar, nothing.
Nothing?
Nothing. Just prayed a lot. That they didn't find us.
Maroon, what year were you born?
I'm sorry?
What year were you born?
1935.
Your grandfather was born the same year.
Your grandfather? Any other questions?
One more round of applause for thanks.